Hi, I'm Meha.
Hey guys, it's Jessica, and today we're going to be showing you guys some forms commonly used by Woodbridge High School Entertainment Corps. We're also going to be showing you guys some tips and tricks on how to adjust your marching technique so that we can make these forms cleaner.
The forms we'll show you today are pods, arcs, long lines, spinning lines, follow the leader, and diagonals. Let's get into the video. Alright, so let's talk about pods. Pods are a form consisting of usually around 4 people, creating a shape in one section of the field. Pods are usually a circle or a diamond shape, and when we make this form, it's usually replicated by most, if not all, sections on the field. Pods are one of the forms where you might be with people from a different section, so it's really important to communicate and make sure everyone is on the same track with forms. There are 3 aspects I'll talk about here, which are hitting a pod, moving in a pod, and holding in a pod. So, here is the WHS EC 2019 field show called Star-Crossed Love, and this is a section of the show where most woodwind sections formed pods right here at the front of the field. So let's watch a clarinet pod hitting their form well. Alright, so here you can see that there are 4 people in the pod, and it would be really easy to figure out where each person is coming from. And by that I mean the previous form that they're in, like where that is in relation to the next form, which is the pod. So you can see that this person right here at the front of the pod is the person who can see the least, if that makes sense, because they're backwards marching into the pod and they can't see anyone else who is in their pod. So it is kind of that person's responsibility to know exactly where their dot is and make that form so that everyone else can guide to them. But let's say that that person ends up a little bit to the left of their dot. They can't see what's going on behind them, so it's the people behind them's responsibility to kind of make sure that that pod maintains its shape and still looks like a diamond, which this pod is supposed to be, and I think they're doing pretty well. So basically, when you hit a pod, you want to guide to the person who can see the least, and you want to maintain that distance between members, which I'll talk about in a little bit when we're moving the pod. So here is the pod moving, and as you can see, they're rotating and they're doing a visual. So we'll go back to that rotation. Here's the pod. So that was the rotation. And I think that something they did really well was that they kept the form nice and tight. And that's what we want to do if we're ever in this situation, because it makes the form a lot easier to navigate, especially because everyone is moving the same distance in this pod. For example, this person is moving 2 steps back, 2 more steps to the right, 2 steps forward, and 2 steps to the left. So when you do that 360 formation, it's really important that all your step sizes are the same. So you can do 2 steps here, 2 steps there, 2 steps here, and 2 steps there, or whatever the count for that move calls for. So when you're moving in a pod, make sure that you're staying tight so that your form stays in the shape that it's supposed to be. Alright, and now we're going to look at them holding in their pod. So right there, right before they turn around, they have to hold a little bit, and I think that's really important because they don't move at all. Once they're out of their visual where they lunge, they go back to their pod and they're not moving at all, which is really important, especially if we're getting judged, because that point in the show is supposed to show that no one in these pods is moving, and that's important to maintain the still effect that we want to see over here. And if one person is moving, that's going to disrupt our score and disrupt what the judges see. So really nice job holding right there, and then they'll turn around and hold again. And what I like about their second hold, let me go back to it, is that they don't start their next move until the next count, the count that they're supposed to, which is also really good to maintain that stillness. And it fits along with the music, which I don't know if you can hear that right now, but they did a really good job with that hold. So good job to this pod. Next, we're going to look at arcs. So arcs can vary in shape from a really round half circle to an arc that is almost a straight line and anything in between. If your form is an arc, there are some things to keep in mind. So I'll talk about 3 aspects of arcs here: mirrors, moving in an arc, and focalizing. Here is the WHS EC 2017 field show called Dia de los Muertos. And if you look over to the left side of the field, you'll see 2 arcs, an outer one of the flutes, and an inner one of the clarinets. So we're going to take a look at the inner one first. And you can see that this person right here in the back and this person in the front are almost the same distance from the left side of the field, side to side. But of course, this person is behind this one. And that's really important because every person in this arc has someone that they can line up behind, except for the outer person if there is one. But here you can see that there are 2 people. So what's really important to keep in mind about an arc is that if you're this back person, you can cover down, as we like to say, to this front person, which means that your head is going to be in line with their head and your steps are going to be in line with their steps. And this helps ensure that the arc has a symmetrical shape. And if you're one of these people in the front, you need to make sure that you're making all your dots so that the symmetry can be replicated at the back. So now we're going to see moving in an arc, and we're going to look at the flutes up front here. So something really important happens right here, and we'll go back to that. The flutes do a direction change right at this line, and that's something really important in an arc because usually you're going to be going from one direction of marching to another. So from here, they're going forwards marching, and then they switch to backwards when they get to this line. And it's important if you're in a section with your arc, let's say, section leaders can help identify the point that you're going to do that direction change so that everyone knows where exactly to turn and the form looks really clean. So the flutes did a really nice job here moving their arc. Another thing I'd like to point out is the spacing. Here it's a little inconsistent, but let's see, toward these 3 players, they have really nice spacing. These 2 are just as far apart as these 2, and that's also important. The way that you would do that in an arc is just to keep your step sizes the same, especially within your section, and we do a lot of reps of these types of sets, and that'll help you memorize the exact amount of steps, the exact step size that you need to take for these forms. The last thing I'm gonna talk about is focalizing, and I can't really show it on here because this is a performance, but we usually focalize during practice. So during our rehearsals, if we were to rep this set, and let's say we would stop here, a flute section leader might call out to the group to focalize, and what they would do is turn inside toward this arc of the curve, and they would look down at their feet and make sure that their spacing is right. Maybe this gap would be fixed and it would become equal with this one. And it basically helps you understand your own personal tendencies when you're marching in this form. So let's say this person tends to march a little too close to this one, and they see that every rep when they focalize, they're a little too close to this person. And they can keep that in mind so that the next reps that they do, they can make sure that, I'll adjust to be a little farther from that person because I know I tend to be close to them. So great job to the flutes and clarinets in these arcs, and we're going to move on. So long lines are present in every field show we do because they form the sections of a block. Usually long lines are within a larger block where there are multiple lines that come together and form columns and rows, but you might encounter a set where you're in a long line by itself. So I'll show you the difference between vertical and horizontal lines in terms of what you should be paying attention to. And since a block has horizontal and vertical lines, you can apply these strategies to virtually any time you march in straight forms. So here is the WHS-EC 2018 field show called Scheherazade, 1001 Stories Told. And in the center of the field, right behind our dance team, you'll see a clarinet block that we're going to be focusing on for their vertical forms, which are these vertical lines. So what we want to see in these forms is that people are covering down. And covering down basically means that you're staying right behind the person in front of you by looking at the back of their head or the back of their neck and their feet to make sure that you are perfectly in line with them and that these lines look straight. So let's watch this block move across the field. And something I really like here is that their forms stay consistent. So you can see that these people are doing a really good job at covering down and staying right behind the person in front of them. And another way that we can do that, besides covering down on the go, is taking consistent step sizes. And that really helps you keep your forms, especially if these two people are taking the same steps as this one. You're going to stay in line even if you're not consciously thinking about covering down. So that is how you stay in line in vertical lines. So now we're going to look at this horizontal line back here in the trumpets and baritones. And this one is actually a really good horizontal line because they're coming into this form and then they hold there for just a little bit before we do a visual. And I really like this line because the spacing is pretty consistent and they are in line with each other horizontally. So what we want to do if we were practicing this at a rehearsal would be to dress, and usually we dress center. So if there was a center person, let's say it's this person, we would do a rep and then we'd all stop right where we landed and look towards this center person and see, are we in line with them with our feet to make sure that that form is straight. And what we can do to make that happen, once again, just like vertical forms, is to take consistent step sizes, and that will make sure that wherever you're coming from, if you keep taking the same step sizes, you're always going to end up in the same place, and everyone next to you can make sure they're in line with you. And this is especially important for the center person, because if everyone is dressing center, they need to be consistent and always land on their dot. So the big takeaways from this are that in a vertical line, you can cover down. In a horizontal line, you can dress center. And in both of these forms or in a block, you're always going to want to take consistent step sizes because that's going to ensure that your form is looking correct. So this clarinet block and this trumpet and baritone line did a really good job with their forms.
So first we're going to be looking at follow the leader. Basically what a follow the leader is a form where everyone is moving in the same direction on a certain path. For the follow the leader, we're going to be looking at 3 key things: maintaining the form, our spacing, and direction changes. In order to maintain the form, the best thing that we can do is to follow the path of the person in front of you in context of the direction that we're moving. So if I'm marching backwards, I will follow the person behind me, and if I were marching forwards, I will follow the person in front of me. So while we're marching, we can imagine that the person is kind of making a path in the field that we can follow exactly. We can use our peripheral vision to know where the path is, but that gets difficult when we're going backwards because we can't see anything. In this case, we can use the markings on the field like the front side line or the front hash to get a better grasp of where we are. During practice, it's a good idea to pay attention to these markings so that you memorize these distances as time progresses. And to strengthen all of these points, you can maintain the distance from yourself and the person in front of you when marching backwards, just as another checkpoint. As for spacing, something that we can keep in mind is our front to backs. when we learn these sets, it's important to take note of the front to backs of the highest and lowest points of the curve so that we don't push too far forwards or too far backwards. Otherwise, the spacing will be different in those sections in comparison to the rest of the field. For example, let's say that when we're marching, I push the curve a little bit too far forwards. What happens is that the curve is a little bit bigger, so the distance between the people at the curve is going to be a lot bigger than the distance between other people on another part of the field. Not to mention, since I just extended the distance a little bit, everybody's going to have to march a much longer distance, which makes the set a little bit more tiring. For the direction changes, you can kind of see at the farthest parts of the curve that sometimes we go from forwards marching to backwards marching. So the thing that helps the most, I think, is to keep a lot of energy in your feet when you're going through these direction changes. When you're switching and swiveling your hips around, it's a good idea to use the platform of your feet to really push and swing the leg around so that you can do a sharp twist to the direction that you're going and to keep the flow of energy the same. And as for these direction changes, the marching coaches will set the direction changes at different points as we learn these sets. Next up we have spinning lines. So spinning lines are usually made of 4 to 6 people. These lines stay together as they rotate and turn in a pinwheel fashion. Today we're going to be focusing on making these forms accurate and consistent through halfway points and step sizes. The first thing that we're going to be looking at is the halfway points. When learning these sets, it's important to figure out the halfway points between the very beginning of the set and the very end of the set so that we can keep our forms consistent. We can do this by dividing the counts and the distances of the sets. So, for example, if the set were a halfway point at count 4, and then I would divide the distance between my first dot and the second dot so that I know where my halfway point is. And then when I take these two things, I can combine them to know that at count 4 I should be at the halfway point that I just picked out. And this approach is really useful because in these forms everyone has a different step size and a different halfway point. These differences make it all the more important that we keep a track of our own dots. If we hit these points, our forms will be accurate all across the field. The second thing is a consistent step size. So say if I were at the very end of the line segment and then I started off with a big step size, and then in the middle I realized that I overshot so that I make my step sizes a little bit smaller. What ends up happening is that the line ends up looking more like a curve than a line, and the effect isn't the same. But if we keep a consistent step size and make sure that we hit our halfway points, our forms will look really good and really clean, and then we'll get that really cool spinning and the turning image. Like, for example, in one of our shows we had kind of like these gates that open up by using these spinning lines. And last but not least, we have the diagonals. The diagonals are probably one of the more frequent forms that we see in our shows. It's basically where we have a straight line that is set at an angle from the front sideline. Today I'm going to be referring to something called an angle a lot, and basically what that is this angle that you can see in this drawing here. This angle is created by the first two people in the very front. As you can see, when I change the distances between these two people, the angle of the diagonal changes as well. Because of this, I'll be talking about the distances between the first two people and how we cover down in these lines so that they're straight. The most important thing about this type of form is the distance between person 1 and person 2. The angle in the front determines how far the people in the back will have to march.
Also, if there are multiple lines, the angle in the front determines how close the people in the back are from each other. If we take a look at this video right here, the diagonals are moving. So if you're like me in this video and you're in the very back, you have a huge step size if the angle is set a little bit too sharp. But as long as the front two people set the angle right, which is relatively simple since you just have to keep the same distance, everything will go smoothly. And the next thing we have is covering down. You're going to want to use your peripherals to look at the person in front of you who's going to be a little bit to your left or a little bit to your right, depending on how the diagonal is set up. You're going to want to compare your front to back and your side to side from the person in front of you when we're learning these sets, so that you have an idea of how far the diagonal is pitched. And then if you keep these things in mind, this will help keep the line straight throughout the entire diagonal. During the set, you can use your peripherals to ensure that you're following the angle of the line, and when we're given the time to check, you can turn your body to face the front of the line to cover it down like it's any other line, and this is super helpful in visualizing how you're situated in comparison to everyone else.
We hope you learned a lot about marching and can take these techniques and use them for your field show.